I want to thank everybody for coming to our second professional panel. This panel's on STEM issues and STEM things. The door down here is open. Sorry, somebody's trying to come to the room. But we have individuals here from as many as 4 different organizations. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if all of them were able to make it, but I'll start with who I definitely see. Okay, that's Janine Detweiler.
Do you have your own by chance?
NYU Langdon Health. And I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Janine, if you want to introduce yourself really briefly and talk about your role.
Hi. Or the other way.
Sorry, did you ask me to talk about my role?
Yeah, you can talk about your role, please.
Sure. I am a genetic counselor with the NYU Langone Health. I work for the Pancreatic Cancer Center specifically, and I have a research focused role.
Okay, thank you. Are any of our other panelists on? Trying to look at my list here and I'm not.
Hi, Scribe America's here as well. Sorry, my camera has a glare.
Scribe America, if you could introduce yourself and a little bit about your role.
Yeah, so I'm Beth. I work with Scribe America and I'm one of our talent acquisition advisors. But I was a medical scribe for 2 years prior to this position.
Okay, great. Any other panelists? And again, I apologize. There may have been some folks who said they were able to and may have had some last minute things come up. So we'll go with our 2 panelists that we have. And again, we have some folks here in the room, as well as several folks on Zoom. For the folks on Zoom, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat. But I'll have some seed questions here that I can start with, and then we'll go from there. So I guess if you could tell us maybe just a little bit more about your organizations, each of you, and either Shanine or Beth, if either one of you want to go first. I know Shanine's already got herself unmuted, so we'll start there. But just tell us a little bit more about your organizations and how they connect specifically to STEM type careers.
Yeah, so I will say this is, I think, my 3rd job since I finished grad school, but I've always worked for hospitals in genetic counseling roles. I got my undergraduate degree in biochemistry from IUP, and then I got my master's degree in genetic counseling from the University of Michigan. I worked for the University of Pittsburgh in a lab in the interim between my undergrad and graduate degree. So in terms of how my current job relates to STEM, I do have a clinical research position. I do not do bench work. But I will say that the foundations that I got in biochemistry and in understanding genetics with my biochem degree were essential to the work that I do now. And then working in a lab, even though it was not my favorite, I always knew that I wanted to do clinic, but it gave me a lot of skills that actually made my molecular genetics classes easier than for some of my peers who didn't have that kind of background. So at the University of Michigan, you take 3 genetics courses, and all people within the Department of Human Genetics, regardless of whether you're getting a genetic counseling degree, a PhD in genetics, like bioinformatics with a genetics focus, everybody takes the exact same genetics courses. There are other genetic counseling programs where they have sort of like genetics for genetic counselors, where they don't get into as much of the science and they focus more on clinics and syndromes. But it was very rigorous. And I think that that's the main through line of STEM in my current job, that, you know, if I didn't understand the basis for why certain genetic mutations can matter, what sort of functional impact they have, you need to understand that before you can scale it up to understanding how does this manifest in a genetic syndrome, and then what are the different treatments, interventions, screenings that are recommended.
Thank you. Beth, you want to tell us a little bit more about your organization and how it relates to STEM and specifics?
Yeah, so at Scribe America, we train and hire medical scribes. So this is a great stepping stone for individuals that are interested in getting into healthcare in various ways, be it like NPs, PAs, doctors, clinicians, all of those opportunities. So as a scribe, you work side by side with a physician, completing all of the documentation. So this is a great way to start seeing how healthcare fits into your personal interests, and then also what actually goes on within the healthcare facility.
Great, thank you very much. Again, taking a quick look, I don't see any of our other presenters. So, last real quick, is there anybody or on Zoom? Apologize for the horrible echo, but we're troubleshooting some microphone issues.
Sounds like when you put two cell phones together on speaker.
Yeah, we're getting that. I consider myself so lucky man. But is there anybody in Zoom or in the room that has a question for our panelists? If not, I've got one. Okay, seeing and hearing. What do the two of you think are either some of the biggest misconceptions that the general public has about careers in STEM, or specifically in your particular role or particular sector? Shani, you're on mute if you're trying to.
Beth, would you like to go first this time?
Yeah, I can definitely go first. So I would say some of the biggest misconceptions from the general public about careers in STEM are that it's like boring, or there's no creativity, and that it's expensive, that you need graduate and higher level degrees to get involved in the STEM field. But there's so many different avenues to become a part of STEM. And then from the creative standpoint, for healthcare specifically, tying it back into Scribe America and that interest, without creativity, we wouldn't be able to diagnose patients or create new ways of treating different diseases and working with patients. So for example, seeing patients as like a puzzle. So if you didn't have that creativity to be able to look at all the different pieces from what the patient's telling you, and the lab work, imaging, all of those things, then you wouldn't be able to actually get down to what's happening with the patient and diagnose them. So I would definitely say the two biggest things are the lack of creativity, and then that the only way to get into STEM is if you have like ample time and money.
I definitely agree with the creativity part. I have a couple of different thoughts. Genetic counseling is a career that a lot of people don't know about unless they've had some sort of personal experience. So I think that there aren't a ton of misconceptions just because it's not as common of a career. Some people think that genetic counseling and testing is only for the prenatal setting, but there are genetic counselors that specialize in prenatal, pediatric, cancer, cardiovascular, a lot of different subspecialty fields like ophthalmology or disorders of sexual development. There can be like metabolic clinics, adult focused clinics, general clinics that see a little bit of everything. So there's a lot of different specialties that I think are less well known. Prenatal genetics was sort of the very first area of genetics that's been around since in like infancy, no pun intended, forms since like the 1980s or so, even before like DNA testing was available. I think that a misconception that I had was that getting a like a bench job or a wet lab job was the main goal or the only option, and that working in a clinical setting wasn't something that was as respected, or sort of that it was like you work in a lab or you become a doctor, and that anything in between wasn't really an option. And there are lots of allied healthcare professional options that can be appealing to you if you aren't a lab person. I will say too that there's certainly creativity involved in my job in a way that's similar to what Beth described. Even within like seeing patients, a lot of genetic counselors use visual aids to explain things to people. And I design a lot of my own, even in coming up with publications and manuscripts in the sort of research job that I have now. It does take some creativity to think about how you best present things. I will say too that there's less math involved than you would think. Or rather, there are lots of different crutches that are available to you if math isn't your strong suit. I actually have a learning disability called dyscalculia, which is, this isn't entirely accurate, but it's sort of like dyslexia, but with math. And I work in a research setting where I crunch data and I just have a lot of different things that help me do that, since my brain doesn't like to do it as naturally as other people's do.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing. I'm gonna try this. Did that help the echo? Okay, so when I'm talking, I'll mute the main mic. I'll mute our main speaker here. That'll help with the whole stadium feel. Okay. Are there any questions from folks in the room or in the chat? Because otherwise I'll keep going. Nope. Any Zoom? Nope. Okay. So can you talk to us about maybe what are some of the skills that you think a person would need to be successful in a STEM career, either generally or in your particular field? And you can take that one or both ways.
These are going to be kind of boring answers. I think organization is really important. I think very early on, I learned different ways for me to keep track of what tasks I need to do, and to use different things like timers and apps and calendars to really make sure that I stayed on task with different things, and also to report to my PI when I worked in a lab where I was with different projects. I think that the other thing that is like, I don't know, this is kind of silly, but it really has helped me when you have to do something that you don't necessarily like certain classes that don't seem applicable, or certain parts of an experiment, or like tedium. It always helped me to view it as just like a hoop to jump through to get to a bigger goal. So I think that the sort of like perseverance or grit of sort of, okay, maybe I have this lab job. I don't like it. It's not my favorite, but it's going to get me somewhere in the future. Having that sort of determination helped me a lot through, especially like my early 20s, to get to more of a job that I actually wanted.
I would definitely agree with those points as well. Organization was very top of my list as well. That will definitely help out. The other thing that I had is just willingness to learn, which I feel like kind of plays along with that. Sometimes if it's not something you're interested in, it's good to like push through and still take in that knowledge, because things in STEM are always changing and adapting much with the world. So it's really great if you have that outlook that you can always learn something new and always be willing to learn something new.
Okay, great. Speaking of the world changing, what are some of the ways that the pandemic and some of the events of the last 2 to 3 years have changed either the way you work or the way your organization does their work?
I don't have a particularly exciting answer to this at this point, other than we used to never have the ability to do like one-to-one telemedicine. So I actually worked at UPMC for 4 years before I moved to NYU. And prior to 2020, we did telemedicine, but the way that it worked was that we had satellite clinics. We had locations at like Hammett and Erie, Johnstown and Altoona, where it would be a secure video chat, but it would be me in Pittsburgh on one end, and it would be a nurse in a clinic room at the other end, and the patient would still come to the hospital. We would do the counseling session through video, and this was mostly for people who like coming into Pittsburgh was kind of a long haul for them, but they were more willing to come to one of these sort of more rural areas. And then the nurse would consent them and take them for a blood draw after. And a big way that the pandemic changed things is that genetic counselors are not CMS recognized providers, meaning that we can't bill for our own time. And that's related to Medicare and Medicaid regulations. And there's a lot of legislature to try and get that changed. So if you were not a CMS recognized provider before the pandemic, you could not do a video visit where it was just you to the patient in their home. That changed. There was sort of like an emergency, I don't quite know the right word, but like an emergency decree or something like that, that we could see kind of anybody at the very beginning. And then it kind of got scaled back to like only states where you had licensure. And if the patient is physically in a different state, you couldn't see them through video. It helped things in that there are some patients where even coming into a hospital was a barrier to their care in terms of cost of gas, cost of parking, getting time off of work. If they had a sick kid, they would have to cancel their appointment. So that ability to do telemedicine and reach the patients in their home has resulted in some ease of access. And for most genetic testing, we can ship a saliva kit directly to a patient. So it reduced some barriers to care and some costs of care. And that's really helpful for certain populations, especially some of the more rural and low income populations that I used to see.
Yeah, so I can definitely piggyback off of that. One of the big things that came out of the pandemic was all of the telemedicine and then also telescribing, the idea that not everyone has to be in one place to connect and get the care they need. They can like log in a more convenient setting for them. Another big change that came out of the pandemic, I actually was a medical scribe in the emergency department during the pandemic. So how patients are seen, the steps we take prior to seeing a patient, even from like an EMS standpoint, just the initial steps you take when working with a patient definitely changed. And then of course, things like masks, gowns, face shield, all of the protective gear. There was definitely a big shift there as well. And really who was seeing who, and then the interaction there as well with those that might be infected with certain things, or those types of connections were definitely changed as well.
Thank you. Gonna ask again, any questions in the room or any questions on Zoom? Great. So I know sometimes a lot of folks, one of the misconceptions that I think I often think of is I need to have some sort of advanced degree to be in a STEM field. I either need to have a master's or I've got to go and become a doctor, an MD, DO, some other sort of, doctor of biology, etc. Are there ways to get into STEM fields without getting an advanced degree, or is that kind of a prerequisite?
Beth, you might be more able to comment on this than me. My degree did require an advanced, my field did require an advanced degree. I didn't want to go to school for more time, to be honest, but I did want this specific job, so I was willing to. I have a few thoughts on some of my friends that also graduated with STEM degrees that didn't go into advanced degrees, but that's sort of secondhand knowledge. So I'll defer to Beth first.
Yeah, so I can definitely talk about the medical scribe position here. So one of the things that I love about this position, and one of the reasons that I chose to become a scribe, was I knew that I had an interest in STEM healthcare, but didn't really want to take on additional certifications and classing while I was already a pre-med undergraduate major. So here with the scribe position, you take a 4 to 6 week paid training. So it's a few classes here and there, but it's not really adding a ton to your schedule. But then that's a way you can start to make those connections within healthcare, start to meet people, start to see if this is what you really like. And then from there, of course, if you're interested in furthering your degree or moving pathways a little bit within the STEM field, that's totally possible from here. But this is an example of one of those opportunities where you don't need an advanced degree to take steps into the STEM field. So with this position, all you need is to be 18 years of age. There's no prior experience or certifications required because of that training. So there's definitely other opportunities like this as well out there. But this is just like one of the more known ones, I feel like, that people use to help them get into STEM and healthcare.
Yeah. Even thinking about some of my peers that were mostly biochemistry and chemistry majors. One of my friends was a lab tech for several years. I also apologize, my cat is almost certainly going to enter the screen at some point here. One of my friends was a lab tech for a number of years, and then he transitioned to working for a microscope company, first as like a repair technician, so going around to different universities and hospitals and repairing microscopes. And then he transitioned to become basically a microscope salesman. And all of that sort of stemmed from his background in STEM, but he didn't go on to get an advanced degree and was intentional in that, thought about what he would have to give up and what it would cost him if he wanted to go back to school. And I think those are sort of calculations that a lot of us do these days. I have other friends that worked in sort of quantitative lab positions, so working in environmental labs or working in sort of like quality assurance positions. I think I know a few other people that went to work in sort of like medical pathology settings, so actually doing like the processing of different lab tests. Within my current sphere of work, when I think about who do I interact with, and do they have advanced degrees or not? So there are certainly people who work for genetic testing companies who run the tests, or who work in an insurance capacity, or who even have like research related roles, that sometimes it's a stepping stone for them to get a job that gets them relevant experience for an advanced degree. But I think they can also be careers in and of themselves. Some people are lab techs for extended amounts of time. A lot of people, it's a stepping stone. But even when I worked at Pitt, I knew a couple of people that were just sort of career techs, and they'd been there for decades, and it was just what worked out for them.
Okay, we have one of our presenters just jump on the line. So I want to give him an opportunity to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his organization. And then I'll also kind of let him jump in on maybe one of the prior questions that we had. So Anton, please, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organization.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Anton Reed. First of all, so sorry for being late. I was in a work meeting that ran way too long. And I didn't realize it was quite that far over. So sorry again. I work for the Homewood Children's Village. I am the director of software over there. We're a local nonprofit in Pittsburgh. We work with Homewood youth and families, and we provide a whole bunch of kind of educational and personal services. We run a bunch of community schools. We have sort of gatherings of community, like one we're having tonight, where there will be fatherhood programs and games and play and cooking classes, all sort of aimed at getting better outcomes for youth in these neighborhoods that have been traditionally underinvested by the city and the state, really. So that's kind of the village in a nutshell. What I do is college and career planning. We have a book that we use to help students in high school plan for what they want to do after they graduate, whether that's college and university or get a job, take a gap year. And we are digitizing that physical book, looks like this, and turning it into a multi-platform app for Android and iOS that you can take those same college and career planning tools and information, but have them in your pocket at all times and never get lost. Instead of it being a kid and a mentor, you can also pull in parents or coaches or the school, and they have everyone on the platform talking at the same time, sharing information and sort of wrapping support around those young people so that they have the best chance at being successful after they graduate.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Anton. I'm going to ask you one of the previous questions that our two other panelists have already addressed, but I'd like to hear it from your perspective since you're coming from a more potentially computer and IT perspective. What do you think are some of the skills that a person needs to succeed in STEM, either generally or in your specific area?
Sorry, the skills that who would need?
I'm sorry too, we may be having, well, pardon me. We're having some microphone issues in the room. The skills that somebody either needs to succeed in STEM or in your specific area, just in general. And let me unmute because we're trying to kill some of that echo issue we've been having.
Sure. Skills in STEM. So I'm a big believer in STEM. My mom is a working class teacher and was an only parent of 3 forever. And so part of the reason that I went to school for computer science was because I thought I want to be financially secure, and I am. I think whatever technical skills that you have, whichever field you go into, is important to sort of study and hone that craft. In some ways, being a programmer is like being an artisan. And from what I know of some of my other STEM friends who are accountants, or some of them do finance, I know a lot of tech people. You're kind of like an artisan. And so honing your craft and your skills and making sure you expand your skill set is important. And that's something you can essentially do on your own once you reach a certain level. And then the other thing that I think is really important in terms of skills, at least for me, everyone might not have this, is I am sort of a natural teacher. And so communicating complex ideas is a thing that I would say better at than most programmers. Programmers can often talk to each other, but they can't always talk to a client or a lay person. And so if you are not the next Steve Jobs, you're not the next best programmer in the world, but you can hack it enough and you can communicate really well. There is a great need for you in the field. There are a bunch of jobs that just don't require you to write a bunch of code, but do require you to communicate with the people who do. So you need to know how. You just don't necessarily spend all of your time doing it. And I think that's one of the underappreciated aspects of software development, is how much of a need there is for communication.
Okay, great. Thank you. Swear again. Maybe. Okay. Anybody, any questions either in the room or in the chat? I know we had somebody who's advocating for their students, if they're in the chat, to take advantage of the folks who are on. If not, I'll go ahead with one question that I have. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges in your field or in STEM just in general at the moment? And I know we have our 3 presenters, Beth, Shannon, and Anton. So whichever of you want to start with that, that's fine. And again, I apologize for the echo, but we've been having some audio issues.
You mean challenges in entering the particular field that I'm in, or challenges that I face as a practitioner in this field? I kind of feel like the first question is more student relevant.
Let's take it in the first way. Take it the way you said it as first. I like that. Thank you very much.
One thing that I used to see when I would review applications for the graduate program for genetic counseling at Pitt was that it does take a level of money and sometimes privilege to get the experience that gets you into a genetic counseling graduate program. So I didn't come from a particularly privileged background. I was lucky in that I had professors at IUP that helped me get a lab job after I graduated. And that made all the difference for me. I think that if I would have had to take a different kind of job and then try to transition into lab work or try to get into graduate school while working like a retail or customer service position, it would have been very difficult. I've seen applicants from students that will work a full-time job as a waitress or something like that, and then they'll volunteer in their spare time, but that is very difficult. The other thing too is that when I worked in a lab, I did a lot of different volunteer work to get crisis counseling experience as well as advocacy experience. So I did things like I did Buddy Up, which is tennis with kids that have Down syndrome. I volunteered with the Albert Einstein Center for the Prevention of Jewish Genetic Diseases at their testing events. I was a volunteer hotline worker and medical advocate for Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. And fitting in all of those things around a full-time job was difficult, but I could do it because I had a full-time job and financial security. So that's a barrier. I would see applications from people that had a lot of potential, but they didn't have help and they did have to take what jobs they could get, which was particularly difficult for people that were graduating right out of the pandemic. Applications cost money too. So sometimes you increase your odds of getting into a graduate program by applying to more places, but if every place costs $100 to apply to, that makes a difference. I think most places are doing Zoom interviews now, even though there is a return to the ability to travel. And I think that's great because it cuts out a significant barrier to lodging and travel for people. But I do think that in my profession, at the very least, we need to find ways to, I don't know. I understand the requirements and that you want people that know that they're committed to healthcare, that you can deal with people who are in crisis, and that you can get the grades that you need to be in a rigorous program. But I don't think that my profession does a very good job of recognizing just how difficult it is to get all of that experience and support yourself, typically when you're in your, early to mid 20s. It's a lot. So that's a challenge to entering my profession.
Elizabeth or Anton?
Yeah, I can definitely build off of that too, or kind of piggyback off of what you just said. So I was definitely thinking like the lack of knowledge and kind of that whole concept of there are so many steps you need to take and things do cost money. So STEM positions are not newer, but the concept, I feel like, of going into a STEM profession is newer, and is definitely something that's being pushed more at a younger age. But there is kind of that lack of, I feel like, knowledge for exactly like what it takes to go into STEM. And then having those like good solid connections and then being able to move forward. Sometimes I feel like it can seem a little like frightening, overbearing, because there are so many aspects of it. So I feel like that is definitely one of the biggest hurdles, is just kind of putting all those different pieces together and then being able to actually see like the bigger picture at the end if you are trying to become like a doctor or a PA, like those type of positions. Just making all the little moving parts work and making sure you're well informed and have that support.
Yeah, my perspective is the biggest real difficulty in programming is it's not that young of a field. It's been around since what, 60s, 70s. But a lot of other professions have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so it's relatively young. It's hard to judge a software developer or a programmer and their quality, just in general in the industry. And so a lot of it is peacocking and throwing around complicated terms. And for younger people, that makes it really hard and can be very intimidating, I think. I taught programming for 4 years, and I would legitimately teach my students the like complicated programmer terms for things after I taught them the concept, so that they could bandy them around as necessary, but also so that they could recognize when someone was doing it to them, because I didn't want them to be intimidated. The answer to that is probably to find a good mentor. And I don't have great strategies for how to do that, but that's really the solution, is they can help you with your career development. They do know when you have a legitimate skills gap that needs to be filled versus when you're just sort of new and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and you're not supposed to be that good yet. And a mentor will be able to tell you that and so many other things. My first job, my boss was invaluable, and I still talk to him to this day, and often thank him because I wouldn't be where I am today without him. And then just another kind of major aspect in my specific field is, if you don't have experience in the workforce as a software developer, because we don't have good ways to test how good you are, what they often do is make you write code specifically for that job, or do an inane and long series of tests and challenges, which take time and are usually unpaid. And so, to the same point that both of the other two panelists made, there's an amount of privilege you need. There's just you have to be prepared to struggle through that phase, and you might not even get the job after. So you could spend 2 or 3 full days working on a technical test and not get the job, and that is a horrible part of the process, but it really is a part of the process of getting this job. And until the industry matures a bit more and has some standardized ways of judging, what can this person do without me taking a day of their unpaid time, new people are really going to struggle. I am beyond that place now. I've been programming full-time for 4 years. I'm a director of software. I won't be doing your coding challenge. I don't care who you are. I'm just not doing it. If you don't think I can code, well, I'll find another job. But if you are looking for your first job, I would not recommend you take that attitude.
Questions, either from folks in the room, folks in the chat? We've got one. Those of you who can see it in the chat, but I'll just read it just in case. What does a typical day in your job look like for each of you?
I have kind of an unusual job now. Typically, a clinical genetic counselor's day will be split into 2 different types of days. One will be prep days where you're preparing to see patients, and then there are clinic days where you're actually seeing patients. So preparing to see a patient involves going through their medical records. I've always worked in cancer genetics, so I would be looking through what cancer screenings a person had had, any genetic testing that had been done previously, trying to get a family tree for them, as well as genetic testing records for any of their relatives, sometimes using software to run risk models to predict the likelihood that they would have a genetic mutation, and then looking into whether or not their insurance would cover testing. And then on clinic days, when you see patients, you talk them through, this is what I think when I look at your family. I'm more concerned or less concerned that there might be an underlying hereditary explanation for the history of cancer here. And then you talk about the possible outcomes of testing, that there might be a mutation found or not, and then what the next steps would be in either scenario in terms of cancer risk reduction options, like screening, preventative surgeries, or blood work to keep track of whether or not we're concerned that a cancer might be developing. And the need to test other family members potentially. I have a research-based job now that is very different in that I do still see patients, but I have pretty limited contact with them. And I mostly spend my time collecting, curating, cleaning data, organizing it for publication, making figures, working on writing manuscripts. I do a lot of work with a proprietary database for the research consortium that we have, trying to figure out how do we phrase these questions better? What are the problems that people have had with data entry? How do we clean this up? How do we make sure that the integrity of this data is solid long-term?
I don't know that I have a typical day. If you took the most typical day, it would be programming in the morning. Before I try to schedule all my meetings for the afternoon, just because I need a long block of time to write code. I can't really do it in an hour, or little bits of time here and there. So I try to write code in the morning when I can escape all of the meetings, and then take a break, take a walk, sort of reset, and then I'll have whatever series of meetings need to be had. But that isn't most of my job. It's a big part, but it's not most of my job because we're kind of running a startup, the Smart Dreams application that I'm building. And so I do all the things that a startup founder would need to do. I have meetings where I network with people and talk to them about the app and see whether they need it or not. I go and table at events sometimes. I have a bunch of internal meetings with the village, and I will volunteer to teach STEM at an elementary school class or go to an evening event. Sometimes I sit on hiring committees. I live a very flexible and fluid life just because we're kind of running a startup. So my day looks different every day.
Yeah, so for the medical scribe position, it does vary a little bit if you're in the emergency department or inpatient facility or outpatient clinics, just because the flow of these departments operate differently. But the overarching day-to-day is working side by side with a physician and seeing patients. So as a scribe, you're responsible for all of the documentation. So you would be documenting what time the patient arrived and then what time they left, everything in between. So things like their physical exam, their review of systems, their history. You would be pulling information from prior events, helping to document diagnoses and follow-up care. So in an emergency department, you don't necessarily know what's going to come through the door. So you're kind of just open for anything that day. It might be a day where there's low volume or nonstop go, 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 where you're seeing 50 some patients a day. While same kind of concept in the inpatient facility, there might be a little more variability. And then in an outpatient setting, you have more set appointments where you would be going from appointment to appointment with the provider.
Okay, we have another question come through on the chat from Gavin. I'm going to try to summarize it, but essentially, and I like this question because it kind of feeds into a design element that our office is starting to push, the concept of life design and designing your life. He doesn't have a specific career in mind, yet he's got a few ideas of what he wants to do. How does he try this out? How does he kind of prototype the kind of career that he might want to have without making a long-term commitment to a company?
Someone else can go first if you want. I've gone first the past couple times.
I think there are two ways that you could go about it. Sorry, I can hear an echo. The first would be to find a bake company and get hired. My first internship was at Booz Allen Hamilton, and if you can get hired at their an enormous government contractor, they do all sorts of things for the government, and they have hundreds and hundreds of projects, billions of dollars worth of government revenue. And at a company like that, you could do something as a project for a period of time. And then I don't remember what the term is, but you can sort of be between projects for a period of time and then try a new thing. And so a really big company, another example would be Amazon, would just have so many people who work for it that if you truly don't want to be siloed, you can, and you have some solid people skills, you can shift around between projects and teams. And then the other solution would depend on how much time you've got left. Internships really are the way to do something like that. And so using the summers would be a great way. I'm not sure what year you are, but if you're a freshman now, then you'd have summer after your freshman year, sophomore year, and junior year. So that's 3 different opportunities to do something for 6 to 12 weeks. And try at least 3 things. And then you could also get internships during the school year as well. So I don't think you have infinite shots at it, but there's some ability to try different things out.
So I was gonna say internships and then also shadowing and networking. So a big one in like healthcare is shadowing. So making connections with providers and different opportunities within healthcare, may that be like clinicians, administrative providers, and shadowing them for a period of time to kind of see what they do in their role and then speak with them about exactly what they do on the day-to-day or how they got to that position. And then from there, you can start to make more connections with other individuals. And typically a lot of schools will have shadowing in place and have those connections that can kind of be a stepping off point. And those are great to do during the school year, or if you want to do them for extended period of time, you can do summers or winters. I would say, if possible, another big one would be traveling to other areas to try to get experiences elsewhere with people that might not be as close attached to you. That way you can just further expand like your network and knowledge and kind of get different views on things.
Completely agree with Anton and Beth. A couple other things that I have recommended to people, especially during the pandemic when shadowing was hard to come by. The worst thing that can happen if you cold email someone is that they won't respond. So there is a website called the National Society of Genetic Counselors, where people can go and search for genetic counselors in their area, look for contact information, and it says whether or not they're open to student contact. I'm sure that directories like that exist for other professions, or even just going to company websites, trying to figure out how do you email someone. If you do talk to someone, record that on your resume as an informational interview. You can have sets of questions that you ask, but sort of write down, who did you talk to? What was their title? When did you talk to them? What did you learn? I've definitely looked at applications for students where they had gone to the effort to speak to people in many different genetic counseling subspecialties at many different healthcare systems. And that was really impressive to me, especially if they had done different interviews over time. It showed a commitment and an interest. And it doesn't sound like a lot to make phone calls and talk to people, but it can really add up. One thing that I think is still valid, but costs a little bit more and requires a little bit more planning, is that there are some professional meetings that you can attend if you are a student member or even like just a lay person. So find out, what are the meetings that people in this profession go to? Do I have any ability to attend them? Sometimes there's a fee to attend the meeting. Sometimes you need to travel. But it's a good way to network. A lot of meetings will have like a networking hour or a job board or like at the genetic counseling meetings every year, they have like an exhibitor hall where there will be people with different genetics related software and testing companies and different hospital systems. And they are just desperate to talk to people and to sell their product. And there's no reason why that couldn't be a job search opportunity for people. I think an easier thing that is kind of post-pandemic is that there are so many genetics webinars and podcasts available. And I knew one person who applied to Pitt during the pandemic, didn't have a single in-person shadowing experience, but she just stacked her resume with dozens of different webinars. She kept track of the different podcasts she listened to, and she really made it clear that she was invested. And I think that these are all sort of low effort ways to test the waters of different professions that you might be interested in. It's a little bit of a time commitment, but if you find yourself listening to a podcast or sitting through a webinar and you're like, this is not for me, you're probably not going to feel differently if you were to shadow someone or if you were to actually work in that field. So I think that's, low risk ways to figure things out. Another thing that's also pretty low risk that I recommend is, again, find out the different organizations that people in your profession are involved in. So I usually tell prospective genetic counseling students to follow like the National Institutes of Health, the American College of Medical Genomics and Genetics, the American Society of Human Genetics. Just follow them on social media. You are probably on Instagram or Twitter or whatnot anyway. And following those accounts will keep you up to date on what's going on in this field. What are the news breaks? What are the issues? What are the legal problems that people are facing? And then you'll sort of get an idea of, do I like this field? Am I excited by this? And if you do get to the point where you're talking with people or you're interviewing, you'll be up to date. You'll know what to talk to people about. You can also look at different textbooks. I always recommend that prospective genetic counseling students buy the main textbook, which is just called A Guide to Genetic Counseling, and read it. There are certainly textbooks where you would struggle to read them without an instructor, but see if there's anything that you can read to familiarize yourself with your field and just ask yourself the question, do I like this? Would I want to learn more about this? Am I struggling to make myself do this in my free time? Because if I am, I'm not going to like it as a job. None of those things are necessarily like paid or experienced, but I think there are ways to immerse yourself and see if you like it or not.
I just want to add, I think all that sounds fantastic. I should have did it myself. There's no usually there's no hard commitments. I haven't seen them, sorry, in my own experience in industry. I've always worked at will, and so I could leave whenever I wanted and they could let me go whenever they wanted. So like the commitment thing is not such a big deal, and I think a lot of industries are that way. And the only sort of caveat I would put to that is people do notice when you job hop too much. So they say the best way to get a raise is to leave your job, and I think it's largely true. But how often you do it does matter. So I'm hiring right now, and that's a thing I look for in people's histories is how many jobs have you had in the last 3 years? Have you ever stayed at a place more than 1 year? Because I don't want to hire you and then have you hop away in a year and now I have to do this all over again. So you can try out a job for 6 months or a year and then move, and that's a pretty common thing. Lots of people do it, and it won't be super unusual, but you wouldn't want to have a new job or maybe 8 new jobs in 8 years or 5 new jobs in 6 years, where it starts to look like you just don't intend to stay anywhere.
Thanks, Anton. I want to kind of head us toward the end because I know we're almost at 6 o'clock here. I guess, is there any one sort of piece of practical advice or maybe a good resource? Like I know Shanine already mentioned a good resource about that particular field, but if we could just do that real quick because we are running up on time. So maybe like 30 seconds, either one quick piece of advice or one quick resource.
Yeah, so I know I've definitely touched on these things already, but find something that you're passionate in and be eager to learn and make different connections within the field. These are going to be great ways to grow and experience different things within the field and really just overall become immersed in the field and then actually start to grow and see what you enjoy from it.
I'll defer to Anton since I gave a bunch of resources already.
Sorry, I was trying to type a message in the chat. Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, just real quick, either like a piece of advice or possibly a resource that, you know, folks who are coming up and through either about STEM or about your specific area.
Well, my advice would be strategic. I don't know you all's histories and the backgrounds that you come from. I wanted to develop like financial stability first in life, and so that was the thing I worked on first. And I think in especially in highly paid STEM careers, there's the potential to make a whole bunch of money. And if you are then responsible with that money, you can branch out and do some more of the stuff that you want to do. So I don't make top dollar as a software developer at my little nonprofit. I am taking rather a large hit in my earning capacity, but I'm a lot happier for it. And that is because I was able to sort of invest in the skills. So I would say a couple of things. One, be strategic, not just about which career you choose, but about within the career where you choose to go. There's a difference between huge companies in any field and much smaller ones. There's almost always some nonprofit or small business that's much more interested in giving, or where you have a lot more flexibility and be given a broader range of responsibilities. And there will also be companies where you're going to do a very specific job over and over and over again. And people like different things. So choose the one that works best for you. And yeah, I would say don't think that you're going to get some job or even some career and do it for 40 years. It does seem like life is going to just be one thing forever in college, but I'm now in my second career. I taught for 4 years and now I've been a software developer. And I could do something else if I wanted to. I don't have to stay in this. So you don't have to stick in anything, but you do need to kind of be strategic about what you want out of life and then drive in that direction. Because there's like no graduation anymore after you get into the career field. And so you have to become the driver of your own career path and your own life path in a lot of ways. So be cognizant of those things.
I think that's a good final thought there at this point. Again, I want to thank our three panelists for joining us tonight. I want to thank those of you who were both on Zoom as well as in the room.